Have you ever felt like God's voice has become a distant echo? Like you're trying to tune into a divine frequency, but all you get is static? C.S. Lewis once wrote, "We may ignore, but we can nowhere evade the presence of God." Yet, what if it feels like God's presence has evaded us? What if the silence is deafening and His guidance feels out of reach? You're not alone, and maybe, just maybe, it's not God who's distant. It's us. In this video, we'll uncover 6 toxic habits that might be creating a wall between you and God's voice, preventing you from hearing Him clearly. And as we dive into the wisdom of C.S. Lewis, will explore how to break those chains and reconnect with the divine voice that's been waiting for you all along. Imagine this: you're holding a radio, trying to tune into a station that once played the most beautiful, soul-stirring melody you've ever heard. At first, it was crystal clear, and every note felt like it was written just for you. But over time, the signal grew faint. Static crept in. Now, no matter how much you adjust the dial, you can't seem to find that station again. That's how many of us feel when we try to hear God's voice. Life gets busy, distractions pile up, and before we know it, the connection feels lost. But here's the good news: the melody is still there. The question is, what's interfering with your signal? Let's take a step back to reflect on something universal. We're all searching for clarity, for answers, for purpose. But what happens when our search leads to silence? Perhaps you've prayed for guidance, begged for direction, and all you've encountered is stillness. It's frustrating, even heartbreaking, to feel abandoned when you need God the most. But Lewis reminds us God whispers to us in our pleasures, speaks in our conscience, but shouts in our pains. Could it be that the silence isn't punishment, but a call to introspection, a chance to confront the habits that block His voice? One of the most toxic habits that create this barrier is holding on to resentment. Think about the last time someone hurt you. Maybe it was a betrayal, a harsh word, or a broken promise. The wound may have healed on the surface, but deep down the bitterness lingers. Lewis describes resentment as a poison we drink hoping it will hurt someone else, but the truth is, it poisons our own hearts, making it nearly impossible to hear the gentle whispers of God. When our minds are cluttered with anger and unforgiveness, there's no room for divine guidance. Another habit that clouds our connection with God is self-sufficiency. In today's world, we're taught to rely on ourselves, to hustle, to grind, to be strong and independent, but in doing so, we often shut out the one who longs to carry our burdens. Lewis warned of this when he said, "Relying on God has to begin all over again every day, as if nothing had yet been done." Self-sufficiency tricks us into believing we don't need God until we find ourselves overwhelmed and wondering why we feel so lost. Perhaps one of the most subtle yet damaging habits is distraction. How many times have you intended to spend time in prayer or reflection, only to be pulled away by your phone, your to-do list, or the endless noise of modern life? Distraction isn't just a habit, it's a weapon. It steals our focus and leaves us spiritually malnourished. Lewis famously said, "The safest road to hell is the gradual one, the gentle slope, soft underfoot, without sudden turnings." Distraction is that gentle slope, leading us away from the path where God's voice is clearest. And then there's fear of what God might say if we truly listened. What if His guidance challenges us, calls us out of our comfort zones, or demands change? It's easier to keep the noise up, to pretend we're too busy to hear Him, than to face the truth He might reveal. But Lewis reassures you, as courage is not simply one of the virtues, but the form of every virtue. At the testing point, facing our fears, opening our hearts to God's voice, is an act of courage that leads to transformation. As we begin to peel back these layers of toxic habits, resentment, self-sufficiency, distraction, and fear, we start to see the roots of our struggle to hear God. But recognizing the problem is just the beginning. In the next part of this journey, we'll explore how to confront and overcome these barriers, guided by the timeless wisdom of C.S. Lewis. Because God's voice hasn't gone silent. It's waiting for you to tune back in. The world we live in is loud. Not just in sound, but in the constant demands, distractions, and desires pulling us in every direction. Have you ever stopped to wonder in this chaos, how does one truly hear the voice of God? To understand the answer, we need to dive deeper beneath the surface of our busy lives into the habits we unknowingly nurture, the ones that block our connection to Him. These habits are not just actions, but mindsets, deeply rooted in the way we think, feel, and react to life. C.S. Lewis, one of the greatest Christian thinkers of all time, once wrote, "God whispers to us in our pleasures, speaks in our conscience, but shouts in our pains. It is His megaphone to rouse a deaf world." But what if, even in our pain, His voice is drowned out not by Him, but by us? What if the habits we've normalized are the very walls that keep us from the comfort, guidance, and love we seek? Let's take a moment to unravel this, starting with where these habits often begin. Imagine this: a person walking through a dense forest at dusk. The light fades and the path becomes harder to see. Instead of slowing down, taking careful steps, or lighting a lantern, they rush forward, their focus on reaching the other side. Branches scratch their skin, roots trip their feet, and soon they're lost. Isn't this how many of us navigate our spiritual lives? We're so busy moving forward, focused on goals, fears, or the next step, that we forget to pause and look for the light. Now let's zoom out and provide some context. These habits, these toxic patterns, aren't born in a vacuum. They come from experiences, upbringing, culture, and even survival instincts. For example, our culture often glorifies busyness, equating it with purpose and success. But busyness without reflection, it leads to burnout, not breakthroughs. And in that burnout, we become numb to the subtle, quiet voice of God. Instead of hearing Him, we hear our doubts, fears, or the world's expectations, all amplified by the toxic habits we've unknowingly embraced. One of these habits is the endless chase for validation. Think about it: how often do we measure our worth by what others think of us? Whether it's likes on social media, praise at work, or acceptance from our peers, this constant chase is exhausting. But more than that, it blocks God's voice because it shifts our focus outward rather than inward. Instead of seeking His validation, we seek the world's, forgetting that the world's approval is fleeting, but His love is eternal. Another habit is holding on to resentment. It starts small: a harsh word from a friend, a betrayal, or an unfulfilled expectation. We tell ourselves it's okay, that we've moved on, but deep down, the resentment lingers, growing like a thorny vine around our hearts. And every time we hold on to it, we close ourselves off from the healing God offers. Resentment not only blocks His voice, but also distorts it, making it harder to discern His guidance amidst our pain. Then there's the habit of distraction. Our lives are filled with endless notifications, to-do lists, and entertainment options. Even when we're still, our minds are racing, thinking about the next thing, worrying about the past, or scrolling through our phones. Distraction is one of the enemy's most effective tools because it keeps us from being present. And without presence, we can't hear the whisper of God, which often comes in moments of stillness. But perhaps the most insidious habit is self-reliance. Now, this may sound counterintuitive because self-reliance is often seen as a virtue, and to an extent it is. But when it becomes our default, when we rely solely on our strength, wisdom, and plans, it leaves no room for God to work in our lives. We become so focused on controlling every aspect of our journey that we forget to trust Him, to let go and let His will guide us. Each of these habits creates a barrier. They don't just block God's voice, they replace it with noise, our doubts, fears, distractions, and pride. And over time, these habits become so ingrained that we don't even realize they're there. It's like living in a house with dirty windows. At first you notice the dirt, but after a while you stop seeing it. The sunlight is dimmed, but you've grown used to it, accepting it as normal. But here's the truth, it's not normal. And it doesn't have to be this way. God's voice is still there, waiting to be heard, just as sunlight still shines behind dirty windows. The question is, are we willing to clean those windows? Are we willing to confront these habits, no matter how deeply rooted they are, and let His light back in? Lewis believed that our struggles are moments of silence, and even our spiritual confusion are opportunities. He saw them as invitations from God, not to punish us, but to draw us closer to Him. And this is where transformation begins, not in avoiding these habits, but in recognizing them, understanding their roots, and replacing them with life-giving practices. As we move forward, we'll uncover not just the habits blocking God's voice, but also the tools to break free from them. It won't be easy. Change rarely is. But it will be worth it, because on the other side of these habits, there's clarity, peace, and a connection to God that goes beyond anything this world can offer. The journey is just beginning. Stay with me, because what we're about to explore next will not only reveal the depth of these habits, but also provide a roadmap to transformation, a way to clear the noise, open our hearts, and finally hear Him clearly. Think back to a time when you felt utterly lost. Maybe it was after a mistake you couldn't take back, a failure that stung more than you thought it would, or a period of silence where you desperately sought answers but none came. That feeling of being lost isn't just disorienting, it's lonely, heavy, and suffocating. Yet in that very loneliness, there's a question many of us fail to ask: what if the silence isn't God's absence, but His invitation? C.S. Lewis described God's silence not as neglect, but as a purposeful pause. He believed that in these moments, God doesn't abandon us, but waits patiently, tenderly for us to confront the walls we've built. But what are those walls made of? And why are they so hard to break? To understand this, imagine a locked door. On one side you stand, desperate to enter. On the other side, God waits, His voice ready to guide you. The key to unlocking the door lies in your hand, but it's tangled in chains of doubt, fear, and the toxic habits we explored earlier. You want to use the key, but the chains feel too heavy to lift. Let's start unraveling those chains by digging deeper into the toxic habits that have wrapped around us, layer by layer. Take the habit of distraction. It seems harmless, doesn't it? A quick scroll through your phone, a Netflix binge, or burying yourself in work. But here's the danger: distractions don't just fill your time, they steal your focus. And focus is where God speaks. The Bible often describes God's voice as a whisper, not a shout, not a roar, but a gentle, quiet whisper. In a world of distractions, whispers are easy to miss. They're drowned out by the noise, leaving us feeling like God is silent when, in reality, we've just forgotten how to listen. Now let's look at self-reliance. It's a mindset many of us wear like armor. After all, who else will solve our problems if not us? But self-reliance, when taken too far, becomes a fortress, a barrier that keeps others out and, more importantly, keeps God out. Lewis once wrote, "Relying on God has to begin all over again every day, as if nothing had yet been done. This means that trusting God isn't a one-time decision, it's a daily surrender." But surrendering feels risky, doesn't it? It feels like losing control. And yet, isn't it true that the tighter we cling to control, the more chaotic life becomes? Then there's the weight of resentment. Think of resentment like carrying a stone in your heart. Each grudge, each unresolved hurt, adds another stone. Over time, the weight becomes unbearable, but we convince ourselves it's easier to carry it than to let it go. What we don't realize is that every stone we carry muffles God's voice. Forgiveness isn't just a gift to others, it's freedom for ourselves. It's clearing the clutter in our hearts so we can make space for God's peace to fill us. But perhaps the most difficult layer to confront is the habit of seeking validation. Deep down, we all want to be seen, valued, and loved. That's human nature. But when our worth depends on the opinions of others, we find ourselves on an endless treadmill running faster and faster, yet never arriving. And in that chase, we lose sight of God's truth that our worth isn't earned, it's given. It's unshakable, rooted in His love for us, not in our achievements or the approval of others. These habits don't just block God's voice, they create an illusion of separation. They make us feel as though we're too far gone, too broken, or too unworthy to hear Him. But here's where the mystery unfolds. God isn't behind the locked door waiting for us to find Him. He's beside us, helping us untangle the chains, whispering, "You're not alone. You were never alone." As we peel back these layers, we begin to see a pattern. Each toxic habit stems from fear, fear of failure, fear of rejection, fear of vulnerability. Fear is the root, and the habits are its branches. But what if fear isn't the enemy we think it is? What if fear is an opportunity, a signal pointing us to the areas where we need God's guidance the most? Lewis believed that courage isn't the absence of fear, but the presence of trust. Trust that even in our darkest moments, God's light is near. Trust that even when His voice feels distant, He's closer than we realize. And trust that the journey to hearing Him clearly isn't about perfection, it's about persistence. So how do we persist? How do we move from knowing our habits to breaking free from them? It starts with small, intentional steps that invite God into our daily lives. Like setting aside moments of stillness to simply listen, even if it feels uncomfortable at first. Like replacing self-reliance with a simple prayer of surrender. Lord, I can't do this alone. I need You. Like choosing forgiveness, not because it's easy, but because it's freeing. And like reminding ourselves daily of this truth: we are loved. We are enough. We are His. As we take these steps, something incredible happens. The chains begin to loosen. The noise starts to quiet. And in the stillness, we hear the voice of God, clear and unmistakable, reminding us of who we are and whose we are. But the journey doesn't end here. In fact, it's just the beginning. The habits we've uncovered are only part of the story. Ahead lies the transformation, the moment where the pieces come together, where the mystery is unveiled, and where we see not just the barriers we've built, but the bridges God is building to bring us back to Him. Stay with me, because what comes next will not only open your heart, but change your perspective. The whispers of God are waiting. Let's uncover them together. You've made it this far, and that says something extraordinary about you. It says you're ready to break free from the chains of toxic habits, ready to clear the noise, and ready to hear God's voice with clarity and purpose. But before we conclude, let's take a moment to reflect on the journey we've just shared. Picture this: the locked door we spoke of earlier. You've untangled the chains. Slowly you turn the key, and the door creaks open. What lies beyond is breathtaking light so pure it warms every corner of your soul. A voice so gentle it feels like a melody written just for you. That's what hearing God's voice is like. It's not just guidance, it's connection, peace, and unwavering love. But here's the truth: the transformation you seek doesn't happen all at once. It's a daily choice, a commitment to let go of what's holding you back and lean into God's presence. And while the journey might feel overwhelming at times, remember this: God doesn't call the perfect, He perfects the called. He's not asking for flawless faith, just a willing heart. As you step into this new chapter, imagine what your life could look like. Imagine waking up each day with a sense of peace, no longer weighed down by distractions, resentment, or fear. Imagine hearing God's voice so clearly that every decision, every step feels guided by His wisdom. This isn't just a dream, it's a promise, a reality waiting for you to embrace it. And here's where I need your help. Not for me, but for the countless others who are trapped in silence, struggling to hear Him. If this message resonated with you, if it stirred something deep within, don't let it stop here. Share this video. Share it with someone who might be carrying the weight of resentment or drowning in distractions. Share it with someone who feels like God has forgotten them, so they can see that He hasn't. And if you haven't already, subscribe to this channel. Not because it's just another click, but because this is more than content, it's a community, a mission, a beacon for those seeking guidance in the wisdom of C.S. Lewis and the timeless truth of God's Word. By subscribing, you're not just joining us, you're fueling this mission, ensuring this message reaches every heart it was meant to touch. Finally, let me leave you with this: the world is loud, but God's voice is louder when we're willing to listen. You are not alone in this journey. Together, we can silence the noise, clear the barriers, and step into a life filled with His love and guidance. So, subscribe now, share this message, and let's change lives starting with yours.